Good morning. My name is Dahiya Doctrine, and I'm going to chair this panel and introduce it a little bit. So to begin with, on behalf of the Center for Palestine Studies and the Middle East Institute, who are co-sponsoring this event, we want to welcome you to this discussion of the recent war in Gaza, which we decided this summer we needed to sponsor an event on to put it in a much larger context, historical, military, political, and even discursive. So I'm just going to say a few things to begin, just thinking about some of the questions that I would like us to just keep in the back of our minds in terms of how this war tends to be framed, at least in the US. And then I will introduce the panelists. The structure of the session is each panelist is going to speak for 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have about 30 minutes for discussion. And there will be ground rules for discussion, but I will share them with you later. Okay. So let me just begin by saying a few words. The war in Gaza felt to many of us, probably to most of us, a little like a deja vu. After all, this is the third assault on the Gaza Strip since 2008. In fact, assaults on Gaza have become so ingrained in the Israeli political establishment that they are referred to as mowing the lawn, a phrase that speaks for itself in terms of the Israeli state's attitude towards killing Palestinians. Nevertheless, in other ways, this war was not just deja vu. It was longer, the casualty count much higher, and the sheer amount of infrastructural destruction unprecedented. So I'm just going to say a few words about some of the frames that seem to be taken for granted by and large in the US public domain as this war was being discussed. First, that the war that began on the 8th of July was a war, quote, between Israel and Hamas. Note, this was not referred to as war between the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, and Hamas. The implication? That while Hamas was targeting Israelis altogether, Israel was targeting Hamas. But let us be clear, this was a war against Gaza and all of its inhabitants. Which brings me to the second question, or set of issues I want to raise. The ability to frame this as a war between Israel and Hamas rests on the assumption about the different intentions of the two warring parties. As we heard over and over again, while Hamas targets civilians, Israel does not. Israel doesn't target civilians, and it doesn't intend to kill them. There are important moral and factual questions worth considering here. There are all sorts of debates about the legality of Israel's strategy, which other panelists are far more equipped to talk about, so I'm not going to talk about that. But I want to raise a question about its morality, since we are also recently told how moral the Israeli army is. What is the meaning or moral force of intention when one knows to 100% probability that one is going to kill a large number of civilians given the very nature of one's assault? After all, Gaza is a densely populated territory cordoned off by air, sea, and land, from which no escape is possible. The IDF dropped bombs powerful enough to flatten 8-story apartment buildings and send large metal gates flying through the air. The Israeli military pounded densely populated cities and refugee camps with shells from Merkava tanks and missiles from Apache helicopters, even areas the IDF had previously told civilians to flee to. There was no safe place in Gaza. There was nowhere to go. Even if the killing of civilians was not intentional, then the distinction between the intended and the unintended has lost all sense here. What difference does it make? And what if it was not unintentional at all? What if making civilians pay a high price for supporting Hamas is precisely the intent? There's all sorts of evidence that Israeli military doctrine does choose to target civilians. In fact, being closer to the logic of the firebombing of German and Japanese cities during World War II than to a logic of counterinsurgency warfare that proclaims to be a project of winning hearts and minds. And that is important to consider. After all, it would force a shift in so much of what is taken for granted in the US public domain about the Israeli state and its relationship to Palestine and Palestinians, who are still, all presumable withdrawals notwithstanding, under its rule. Now, Rashid is going to talk about military doctrine today, so I'm going to leave that there. Finally, I just want to say a few words about the question of civilian casualties and how we count them. We hear a lot about what percentage of the casualties really were civilians. But how do we identify civilians? To bring up just one point, as Maya Mikdashi has asked in an article she published in Jadaliyya, can Palestinian men be victims? To be a Palestinian male of a certain age, certainly a teenager through one's mid-30s, and perhaps a male as young as 8 and a man as old as 50, is by definition to be a combatant. One is guilty of being a terrorist by definition. The racial logic is deeply gendered here. Unlike African American men in US cities, as we witnessed with renewed force this past summer, Palestinian men are guilty prima facie of something, even if we are not sure of what. For all the questions raised about the actual number of civilian casualties, the question of whether or not Palestinian men can be civilians, and thus be considered victims and not combatants, does not seem to enter into the fray of debate. Okay. Now I'm just going to introduce our panelists, who I'm going to introduce them in order of their talks. So Rashid Khalidi, who's probably known to almost everybody here, and who I've known for a very, very long time, is the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia here in the History Department. He is probably the most prominent Palestinian academic today, who has as much presence in the scholarly world as in the public domain. And he has written numerous books on the history of Palestine and on US foreign policy in the Middle East. Rashid is the editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies and a key figure in the Center for Palestine Studies. And his 3 most recent books are Brokers of Deceit, How the US Has Undermined Peace in the Middle East, Sowing Crisis, American Dominance and the Cold War in the Middle East, and The Iron Cage, the story of the Palestinian struggle for statehood. It is also a pleasure to welcome Noura Arafat to Columbia for this event. I read a lot of what she wrote this summer on the war and found it so erudite and eloquent that I decided we had to have her here. So, welcome. Noura is an assistant professor at George Mason University who has a long record at this point as a human rights activist and attorney. And she has experience not just working on questions of Palestine, but also working on domestic issues as legal counsel on Capitol Hill. Noura is also the co-editor of Jadaliyya, which is a relatively new and extremely important online publication that deals with kind of reports on the contemporary Middle East, but with a lot more depth than that term suggests. So I would like to welcome both of you, perhaps to, well, you can decide whether you want to come up immediately, but I turn over the floor to Rashid. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. We have a grim topic to discuss, so let's get right to it. My talk is entitled Israel's War on Gaza, the Dahiya Doctrine, Proportionality, and War Crimes. As we all know, in July of this year, Israel launched its 3rd and most massive assault on the 1.8 million people of the Gaza Strip in a period of less than 6 years. In so doing, it has killed over 2,100 Palestinians and wounded more than 11,000. The vast majority of these 13,000 casualties were civilians. Over half of them were women, children, old people, and the disabled. My central topic today is military and other aspects of this latest massacre of the innocents. Given the absurd description of Israel's devastating attack on Gaza as self-defense, and the equally absurd description of Israel as the victim by US and Israeli politicians and most of the mainstream American and Israeli media, it's necessary to place this assault in context. I want to consider today, in particular, precisely what this assault consisted of and how utterly disproportionate it was, irrespective of any possible provocation by the Palestinian side. My talk today will not consider the lead-up to the Israeli attack or the likelihood that by its aggressive actions against Hamas in the weeks that preceded the attack on Gaza, actions in the West Bank and in then in the Gaza Strip, that the Israeli government and security forces may have deliberately provoked this entire episode. I will not consider that topic. Now, it's worth recalling, as Nadia mentioned, that this was only the most recent and maybe the most lethal of Israel's wars on Gaza. In an article that is going to be published in the upcoming issue of the Journal of Palestine Studies, an issue that will focus on the Gaza war, the French historian Jean-Pierre Filiu, who was actually taught here at Columbia and teaches at Sciences Po, described this as the 12th Israeli war on Gaza since 1948. He goes into each of these different campaigns at different phases. During this campaign, over a period of 51 days in July and August, Israel's Air Force launched more than 6,000 air attacks, and its Army and Navy fired about 50,000 artillery and tank shells. Together, they utilized what has been estimated as a total of 21 kilotons, or 21,000 metric tons of high explosives. The attack from the air involved weapons ranging from drones, weapon-firing drones, and American Apache helicopters firing US-made Hellfire missiles, to American F-16s carrying 2,000-pound bombs. According to the commander of Israel's Air Force, there were several hundred such attacks by F-16s on targets in Gaza, most of them using these extraordinarily powerful 2,000-pound bombs. Now, let me say a little bit about a 2,000-pound bomb. A 2,000-pound bomb creates a crater 15 meters wide and 11 meters deep. That's 5 times the height of a human being, the tallest human being. It sends lethal fragments to a radius of 365 meters. That's the better part of a diameter, the better part of a kilometer. Everybody within that diameter would be endangered. 1 or 2 of these bombs can destroy a multi-story building, many of which were leveled in Gaza City towards the end of the Israeli air campaign in the second to last week of August. There's no public record of exactly how many of these 2,000-pound monsters were dropped on the Gaza Strip, or whether even heavier ordnance was used. But from what the commander of the Israeli Air Force has said, there were certainly hundreds of them used. In addition to aerial bombardment, according to a report issued by the Israeli Logistical Command in mid-August 2014, well before the final ceasefire took hold on August 25th, 26th, the Israeli military had fired about 49,000 artillery and tank projectiles into the Gaza Strip. Most of these were artillery shells. Now, artillery shells fired by the US-made M109A5 155 millimeter howitzer, which is the main gun used by Israel. They also have an Israeli-made gun. These projectiles have a kill zone of about 50 meters in radius, so 100 meters diameter. And they inflict casualties within a diameter of 200 meters. So if you're within 100 meters of where one of these shells falls, you'll die. And if you're within 200 meters, there's a chance of your being injured. Israel possesses 600 of these artillery pieces and 175 of the heavier and longer range 175 millimeter guns. And I'm going to examine now in detail one example of the use of these lethal weapons during this offensive. On the 19th and 20th of July, elements of the elite Golani, Givati, and paratrooper brigades launched an assault along 3 axes from the east, from the northeast, and the southeast into the Shuja'iyya district of Gaza City. This is on the eastern side of the city center. The unit in the middle, the Golani Brigade, in particular, met fierce and unexpected resistance that resulted in 13 Israeli soldiers being killed and perhaps 100 being wounded. According to American military sources, over a period of 24 hours during this operation, 11 Israeli artillery battalions, employing at least 258 of these artillery pieces, fired 7,000 shells into this neighborhood. These included 4,800 shells during one 7-hour period. Now, you may be numbed by these numbers, 155 millimeter gun, 200 meter range. Think of each of these shells as killing everybody within 100 meter diameter. Every one of these 4,800 shells fired during a 7-hour period. A senior Pentagon officer who, according to the source I found, had access to the US government's daily briefings, called this amount of firepower massive and deadly. He described this as a huge amount of artillery fire, such as would normally be used by the US Army in support of 2 entire divisions comprising 40,000 troops. Another, a former American artillery commander, estimated that the US military would employ that number of guns only in support of an Army Corps of several divisions. A retired American lieutenant general described this Israeli bombardment as, quote, absolutely disproportionate. It bears repeating that in addition to massive attacks from the air, this firepower was used for an artillery bombardment of one neighborhood over about 24 hours. Now, the guns, the artillery pieces that were involved in this intensive bombardment are battlefield weapons. They're designed for lethal fire over a wide area against dug-in troops wearing body armor and helmets, or against fortifications, or against armored vehicles. They can fire precision-guided munitions, but as they were used against Shuja'iyya, they are inherently imprecise. Like airstrikes using 2,000-pound bombs, they're used in this manner in the heavily built up and crowded areas within the Gaza Strip, such as Shuja'iyya or Beit Hanun in July, or Khan Yunis and Rafah in the southern part of the Strip in August, necessarily and inevitably causes extremely heavy civilian casualties and massive damage. You cannot use those weapons in this environment without necessarily and inevitably killing large numbers of people. This is especially true in a place as crowded as the Gaza Strip. This is an entity of 360 square kilometers, about 40 kilometers long by about 9 kilometers wide, which includes some of the most heavily populated areas on Earth. Its besieged people have nowhere to flee when they are attacked with such weapons, even when they are given prior notice that their homes are about to be destroyed, as occasionally happens. Beyond the injuries that these weapons inflict on human flesh, bombardment, air bombardment, and artillery fire on this scale causes enormous destruction to property. As a result of this war, over 16,000 buildings have been rendered uninhabitable, a proportion of them completely destroyed, a proportion simply damaged, including entire neighborhoods in Shuja'iyya, Rafah, Beit Lahia, and Beit Hanun. A total of 277 UN and government schools, 17 hospitals and clinics, all of Gaza's 6 universities have been damaged, as have 40,000 other buildings. Perhaps 450,000 Gazans, we don't have an exact number, but about a quarter of the population have been forced to leave their homes, and many, probably most of them, no longer have homes to go back to. Now, let me stress, and I think this is the most important thing, let me stress that these are not random occurrences, and this is not collateral damage. To believe that is to willfully suspend belief. It is to ignore completely the nature of the weapons used. And most important, which I just discussed, but equally important, it is to ignore Israeli military doctrine, the stated doctrine of the Israeli military. The wholesale killing and mangling of 13,000 people, most of them defenseless civilians, and the wanton destruction of the homes and property of hundreds of thousands of people is in fact fully intentional. It is the fruit of a sinister strategy implemented by the Israeli military, at least since the assault on Lebanon of 2006. This strategy goes under the name of the Dahiya Doctrine. I didn't make this up. The person who invented it made it up. It was revealed publicly 2 years thereafter, in other words, 2 years after the 2006 war, by Major General Gadi Eisenkot, who at that time was head of the Israeli Northern Command. Since 2013, he's been Deputy Chief of Staff. He's a leading candidate to become the head of the Israeli military. After an entire southern suburb of Beirut, known as the Dahiya, was devastated from the air by forces under his command, mainly using the 2,000-pound bombs that I've talked about, but also some larger ordnance, apparently, in the summer of 2006, Eisenkot gave an interview in which he was explicit in publicly laying out this Dahiya Doctrine. He said, I'm quoting, "What happened in the Dahiya quarter of Beirut in 2006 will happen again in every village from which Israel is fired on. We will apply disproportionate force on it and cause great damage and destruction there." So this is going to be done again. This is our doctrine. We will apply disproportionate force and we will cause great damage and destruction there. From ours, I'm continuing to read the quote. From our standpoint, these are not civilian villages. They are military bases. This is not a recommendation. This is a plan, and it has been approved. He was speaking with the permission of the then Chief of Staff. Now, what General Eisenkot described is precisely what Israel did in Lebanon in 2006, in the Dahiya and elsewhere, and what it has now done in Gaza for the third time in 6 years. Israeli military correspondents and security analysts have reported that this was the doctrine that was employed during the war in Gaza this past summer. Now, let me be frank. This is actually less of a strategic doctrine than it is an explicit outline for collective punishment, which entails probable war crimes. I say probable because I'm not a lawyer. I'll leave that to Professor Rashid to discuss. Not surprisingly, well, I wasn't surprised, but not surprisingly, one found little mention of the Dahiya Doctrine in statements on the war by US politicians, or in the reporting of it by most of the mainstream American media, where we found inane discussions of intentionality and nobody meant to do it and it's terrible, but whatever. Now, there's another aspect that I want to mention. The Arms Export Control Act of 1976, which governs American military sales to foreign countries, specifies that American-supplied weapons must be used for, quote, legitimate self-defense. Given this provision of the law, when US officials from the president on down describe Israel as operating in self-defense in its attacks on Gaza, they may be more than just obediently parroting the line laid down by Israel and its zealous supporters, though they're certainly doing that. They are perhaps also speaking thus on legal advice, so as to escape liability under US law and potential prosecution for war crimes alongside the Israeli officials who are actually responsible for giving the orders and for those who actually pull the trigger. There remains the issue of proportionality. Now, as you may know, together with establishing whether there was direct targeting of civilians, this is central to determining whether certain acts of war rise to the level of war crimes. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but this is what I understand. I would suggest that General Eisenkot's own words would seem to establish intentional disproportionality on the part of Israel. As I read to you, he brazenly states that Israel uses, quote, disproportionate force. I would argue further that the nature of the weaponry used by Israel and the way it used it and the disproportionate firepower between the two sides would seem to bear this out as well. Let me briefly touch on another subject which is often raised, which is Hamas's responsibility in terms of potential war crimes. I will leave aside for the moment what I think is a vital distinction between the force used by an occupying army and the force used by groups among the population under occupation. I think it's an important subject. I can't get into it now. I could if you want questions. I think these are very different. But in any circumstances, both sides are required to obey the laws of war and international law generally, including not targeting civilian populations. Israel claimed that during the war, Palestinian groups led by Hamas and Islamic Jihad fired about 4,000 rockets at Israel, perhaps a little more than 4,000. Now, deadly, although these rockets certainly can be, few of them, in fact, I think it's pretty clear that none of them have sophisticated guidance systems. None of them are precision-guided munitions. And this means that their use was generally indiscriminate and could certainly be seen as targeting civilians in a very large proportion of cases. So presumably this would expose the people who used them to charges of war crimes. But I want to make another point, which is that none of these rockets, most of them were artisanal, homemade qassams, but none of these rockets had a warhead of the size or lethality of even one of the 49,000 tank and artillery shells fired by Israel between July 8th and August 26th. The US-made M109, the 155 millimeter gun, fires a 43-kilogram shell. The Soviet-designed Grad rocket, the most common rocket used by Hamas, except for the much smaller qassams, is normally mounted with a 20-kilogram warhead. So the artillery shell has a 43-kilogram, it weighs 43 kilograms. The warhead of the Grad is about 20 kilograms. Most of the rockets fired from Gaza were actually fitted with smaller warheads in order to increase the amount of propellant and thereby increase their range. And most of the homemade Qassams, which are the overwhelming majority of these 4,000 rockets, actually had considerably smaller warheads than these. All of the rockets fired from Gaza that actually reached Israel, in fact, many of them were so imprecise and poorly manufactured that they fell short and landed within Gaza. All of these rockets, Katyushas, Grads, Qassams, and others, probably had less explosive power than 10 2,000-pound bombs, of which Israel dropped hundreds. So we're talking about an incredible disproportion in terms of the actual weight of high explosive being fired by each side. Nevertheless, it's important to recognize that the rockets fired by Hamas and its allies had a powerful psychological effect, which is paradoxically increased by their very high degree of inaccuracy. As we were told endlessly and actually accurately by the US, this is rare that it was accurate, by the US media, the firing of these weapons obliged large segments of the Israeli population to spend long periods of time taking shelter in bomb shelters or elsewhere. However, as we also were told, thanks to Israel's excellent early warning system and thanks to its state-of-the-art American-supplied anti-missile capabilities, these rockets were very rarely lethal. 4,000 rockets killed 5 Israelis, one of them a Bedouin in the Naqab, a region where the Israeli government refused to build bomb shelters for the Arab population, and also a Thai agricultural worker, for a total of 6 civilians killed. It's thus quite clear that as these rockets are used by Hamas and its allies, although they have a major psychological effect, which is their major intended, I think, effect, they are not particularly powerful weapons. Certainly not when compared to the 21 kilotons of warheads employed by the Israeli military. Now, one would never have guessed any of these things from the media and political hype that Israel and its boosters have managed to generate around rocket fire from Gaza. Focusing on the rockets has an inestimable value for Israel. It obscures the crucial context without which it is so easy to depict the victim as the victimizer and vice versa. This context includes the vital fact that Palestine is in the 48th year of what has become, that we are currently in the 48th year of what has become a perpetual occupation of the West Bank. I say perpetual not because it's gone on for 48 years, but because none other than the Israeli Prime Minister this summer said it's going to go on forever. It has gone on for 48 years, but it's not going to end. He made a statement where he said, this is going to go on. It has to go on. We'll never relinquish security control of these territories. This is as true of the Gaza Strip as it is of the West Bank, since the Gaza Strip is completely controlled from without by Israel. Let me stress that the Gaza Strip is not a so-called enemy entity in the absurd legalese concocted by the Israeli government to conceal what it is really doing. The Gaza Strip, in the eyes of international law, in the eyes of the United Nations, even in the eyes of the US government, imagine that, is an occupied territory, which Israel has subjected to periodic attacks and to a blockade that has been ongoing since 2007. In fact, there have been closures going back to 1993, but the blockade has been going on since 2007. Israel does these things in violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which enjoins the occupying power to protect the population under its control. Instead, it has been besieging and periodically attacking it. Very simply put, the people of Gaza are being punished collectively by the occupier that is supposed to protect them, according to international law. They're being punished for the crime of resisting an unending, perpetual, and violent occupation that has deprived them of their freedom for over 2 generations. Finally, it is worth recalling the origins of over 2/3 of the population of the Gaza Strip that has suffered these attacks, and that has perhaps been more brutally treated by Israel since 1948 than any segment of the entire Palestinian people, with the possible exception of the Palestinians living in Lebanon from the late 1960s until 1982. The refugee population of the Gaza Strip, this is about 2/3 of the 1.8 million people, is made up of individuals who were originally driven from their homes in the southern parts of Palestine, Jaffa southwards, as part of the ethnic cleansing carried out by Zionists and after May 15, 1948 by Israeli forces. This ethnic cleansing, I can't repeat this enough, was an absolutely necessary precondition for carving a majority Jewish state out of a country that in 1948 was 65% Arab. You could not have had a Jewish state in a country with a 2/3 Arab majority without ethnic cleansing. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't unintentional. It was necessary. It was a precondition. You couldn't have done it otherwise. It was the foundation of a Jewish state, was to make it an un-Arab state, i.e. ethnic cleansing. So the bulk of the population of Gaza is made up of refugees from the very areas, ironically, where most of the rockets fired from Gaza have been falling. Many of them have now been made refugees yet again, an experience that is sadly all too familiar to Palestinian refugee populations in Lebanon, in Syria, and elsewhere. Okay, let me conclude. Let me say that these kinds of facts, what I've given you is almost entirely drawn from Israeli sources, mainly Israeli military sources and American sources. Okay? I have not made these numbers up. You can get them on Wikipedia if you want, but you can go into the Israeli press and get even more detailed and even more accurate facts than on Wikipedia, and that's what I've drawn on. Facts of this sort, and this sort of analysis, is what should play a much larger part in American political and mainstream media discourse, instead of the perverse and distorted babble that prevails amongst our politicians and on television and much of the rest of the mainstream media. Correcting the skewed and essentially fantastic images that our politicians and our media propagate of this summer's carnage and of the entire conflict is necessary if anything is ever to change in Gaza, in Palestine, and the Middle East generally. This is because the United States is not just a honest broker, disinterested observer, superpower standing around on one leg. The United States is the essential enabler without which these massacres and this oppression could not possibly continue. Now, some of you may have noticed, since the summer ended, that we are facing a fierce campaign to prevent any serious discussion of these issues, and indeed any presentation of one side of the issue in public forums in general and in universities in particular. Let me end by saying that I believe it is our duty as citizens, it is our duty as responsible human beings to resist these pressures, whatever the cost, and to do everything possible to prevent possible war crimes being committed with our tax dollars, with American weapons, and in our name. Thank you very much.